I never imagined my entire life would crumble into chaos within a single afternoon because of the selfishness of one person. I am writing this post using a disposable account to protect my privacy because I absolutely do not want my judgmental relatives to find my main profile. My name is Delilah, and I am a 23-year-old graphic designer currently living in Tulsa. My peaceful existence was completely shattered that day when my older sister returned home unexpectedly with a car full of designer clothes. She drove into town with a car full of designer clothes after her wealthy husband filed for divorce. My sister walked through the front door like a queen, not like someone who had just lost her marriage. She threw her expensive Louis Vuitton bags onto the floor and sneered at how small our living room was. Her sharp, critical eyes immediately locked onto my bedroom door, and my heart started pounding with nerves. That room used to be a cold garage, and I paid to renovate it with the money I worked hard to earn from my graphic design job. I knew exactly what she was thinking as she stared at my cozy space with greedy hunger while completely ignoring everyone else in the room. The atmosphere in the house grew heavy when my father called my name from the kitchen with a grim look on his face. He motioned for me to come over and speak privately with him and my mother, a conversation that would change everything. If you enjoy stories like this, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel because it truly helps me continue sharing. I followed my father into the cramped kitchen where my mother, Monica, was already sitting at the small wooden table with her hands clasped tightly together. The air in the room felt incredibly thick with tension as I pulled out a metal chair to sit opposite them, while trying to keep my composure. My father, Ralph, cleared his throat nervously before he started the conversation by saying that the family needed to make significant adjustments to accommodate Savannah during this difficult transition. He looked directly into my eyes and told me that Savannah was suffering from severe emotional trauma because of her sudden divorce, which required a comfortable space for her healing process. My mother nodded her head in agreement, as she added that the living room couch was simply not suitable for someone who was going through such a devastating life event. They dropped the bombshell proposal that I should voluntarily give up my renovated bedroom to Savannah so she could have the privacy she needed to recover. I felt a surge of cold indignation rising in my chest because I could not believe they were seriously suggesting such an unfair arrangement. I took a deep breath before I reminded them that the room was originally a dusty garage full of spiders until I paid to fix it. I listed every single improvement I had financed with my graphic design salary, including the insulation, the new flooring, and the heating unit that made the space livable. I also pointed out that I contributed $300 for groceries every single month, which gave me the right to occupy my own private space in this house. I told them firmly that I would not move back into the public living room just because Savannah felt entitled to the fruits of my hard labor. My logical arguments seemed to bounce off them because they were already convinced that Savannah's happiness was the only priority that mattered in this household. The door to the kitchen suddenly flew open because Savannah had been eavesdropping on our entire conversation from the hallway the entire time. She stormed into the room with fresh tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face as she pointed a manicured finger in my direction. She screamed that I had always been jealous of her success, and that I wanted her to suffer in the cramped living room while I enjoyed luxury. Her voice cracked dramatically as she accused me of kicking her while she was down just because I was bitter about her having a husband while I was single. She turned to our parents and wailed that I did not care if she died from depression as long as I got to keep my precious bedroom. Her performance was so incredibly dramatic that a stranger might have actually believed she was the victim in this situation. Monica immediately jumped up from her chair to wrap her arms around Savannah in a protective embrace, while she glared at me with pure disappointment. She scolded me for being so cold-hearted toward my own sister when she had just lost her marriage and her affluent lifestyle. She claimed that my refusal to help proved that I was a selfish little girl who did not understand the true meaning of family loyalty. My mother said she was ashamed that she had raised a daughter who valued a room more than the mental health of her own flesh and blood. I sat there in silence while they painted me as the villain simply for wanting to keep the space that I had built with my own hands. Ralph lost his patience with my defiance and slammed his heavy hand down on the kitchen table to silence the chaotic room. He looked me in the eye with a coldness I had never seen before as he delivered his final ultimatum regarding the living arrangements. He stated that I had exactly 3 days to either vacate my bedroom for Savannah or pack my bags and leave this house permanently. He told me that at 23 years old I needed to learn how the real world works if I was going to be so stubborn about sharing. He said that as long as I was living under his roof, I had to follow his rules, regardless of how much money I contributed to the household expenses. I looked over my father's shoulder to see Savannah burying her face in my mother's shoulder, to hide a triumphant smirk that was curling on her lips. That single malicious expression told me everything I needed to know about my place in this twisted family hierarchy. I realized in that moment that arguing with people who were committed to misunderstanding me was a complete waste of my energy. I did not shed a tear or beg them to reconsider their unfair decision, as they probably expected me to do. I simply nodded my head once to acknowledge his terms, before I turned around to walk out of that suffocating kitchen. I knew that I would not spend another minute fighting for a place where I was clearly not wanted or respected. 2 days after the family meeting, I found the perfect opportunity to execute my departure when my parents took Savannah to the shopping mall to cheer her up. They left the house in high spirits because Ralph had promised to buy Savannah an entirely new wardrobe using the emergency credit card that he usually kept hidden for serious medical expenses. I waited until their car disappeared around the corner before I immediately dialed the number of a moving company that I had contacted secretly the night before. I spent the next 3 hours systematically dismantling the sanctuary I had created, because I refused to leave behind a single item that I had purchased with my own money. I packed all my clothes and books into cardboard boxes before I proceeded to unscrew the expensive air conditioning unit from the wall. I rolled up the floating floorboards I had installed over the concrete and took down the custom lighting fixtures that gave the room its warmth. When the movers finished loading the truck, the space was no longer a cozy bedroom, but had returned to being a cold, dusty garage with stained concrete floors and exposed insulation. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction, knowing that Savannah would come home expecting a luxury suite, but would find nothing but a hollow shell. I drove my car across town to the modest suburban home of my Aunt Betsy, who had always been the one person in the family who treated me with genuine kindness. She opened the front door with a welcoming smile that quickly turned into a look of horror when she saw my tear-stained face and the mountain of luggage piled in her driveway. I sat on her living room sofa and poured out the entire story of how my parents had chosen Savannah's comfort over my basic need for housing. Betsy listened to every word with growing indignation before she hugged me tightly and told me that I could stay with her for as long as I needed without paying a single cent. She expressed her absolute disgust at her brother's behavior and promised that she would help me get back on my feet no matter what it took. The atmosphere shifted later that afternoon when my grandmother Louise arrived at the house for her weekly Sunday coffee tradition with Betsy. She walked through the door carrying a box of pastries but stopped dead in her tracks when she noticed my boxes stacking up against the hallway wall. Her sharp eyes immediately darted between me and Betsy as she demanded to know why her granddaughter was living out of suitcases instead of being at home. I tried to compose myself as I retold the events of the last few days, including the ultimatum Ralph had given me and the cruel way they had prioritized Savannah. Grandma Louise listened to my explanation in complete silence while she slowly stirred sugar into her porcelain coffee cup with a silver spoon. Her expression transformed from confusion to a terrifying calmness that was far more intimidating than any shouting match I had ever witnessed. She placed her coffee cup back onto the saucer with such force that the china clattered loudly against the glass table and made us both jump. She looked directly at me with blazing eyes and said, "Do they dare to kick you out of my house? Has Ralph forgotten who actually pays for the roof he is currently hiding under?" I looked at her in confusion, because I had always assumed that my parents owned the house they had lived in for over 2 decades. Grandma Louise shook her head and revealed the shocking truth that the property in Tulsa was entirely under her name, and she paid the property taxes every single year. She explained that she had allowed Ralph and Monica to live there rent-free for 20 years, under the strict condition that they raise their children in a stable and loving environment. She told us that by kicking me out onto the street to please Savannah, they had violated the only rule she had ever imposed upon them. Grandma Louise reached into her purse to retrieve her smartphone and told me to wipe my tears because the time for crying was officially over. She dialed a number that I did not recognize and spoke with an authoritative tone that sent shivers down my spine. She instructed her personal lawyer to immediately draft a set of eviction papers because she was ready to teach her stupid son a lesson he would never forget. It was Sunday evening when I slowly pulled my sedan into the familiar concrete driveway with Grandma Louise sitting silently in the passenger seat beside me, holding her leather purse with a grip of steel. The 2-story house was blazing with bright lights from every single window, which cast a cheerful glow onto the front lawn that stood in stark contrast to the darkness swirling in my stomach. I turned off the ignition and could hear the distinct sound of boisterous laughter drifting through the front door, which remained unlocked, as if they had not a single care in the world. It felt like a physical blow to my chest to realize that my family was celebrating my departure, as if they had just successfully removed a cancerous tumor from their lives instead of their youngest daughter. I walked around the car to help Grandma Louise out of the passenger seat, and she walked toward the entrance with a determination that made her seem 10 feet tall, despite her elderly stature. We stepped into the entryway without knocking, and were immediately greeted by the overwhelming smell of pepperoni pizza and the sight of my family gathered comfortably around the coffee table in the living room. Savannah was holding a greasy slice of pizza in one hand and a black marker in the other, as she gestured wildly toward the wall that separated the living area from my former bedroom. She did not notice us standing there as she loudly outlined her architectural vision for the space that used to be my sanctuary. "If we hire a contractor to knock down this ugly wall tomorrow, I can finally install those custom shelves for my Louis Vuitton collection because this room is currently just wasted space." Ralph and Monica were nodding enthusiastically at her selfish suggestions while they calculated how much the renovation would cost, without even noticing that we were standing right behind them observing their celebration. They were literally planning the destruction of my hard work before my bed was even cold. Grandma Louise lifted her heavy wooden cane and brought it down hard against the hardwood floor, creating a thunderous crack that echoed through the entire house like a gunshot. The laughter died instantly as all 3 heads whipped around to stare at us with eyes wide with shock and pieces of pepperoni falling from their open mouths. Ralph practically jumped out of his skin before he frantically wiped his greasy hands on his denim jeans and stumbled to his feet to greet his mother. He forced a terrified smile onto his face and stammered a greeting while trying to block our view of the renovation sketches scattered on the table using his broad body. Grandma Louise did not return his smile, nor did she accept the hug he awkwardly attempted to offer her in his state of panic. She simply stared at him with eyes cold enough to freeze hell before she asked him calmly where his youngest daughter was currently living at this moment. Ralph shifted his weight from one foot to the other, while his eyes darted around the room looking for an escape route that did not exist. He cleared his throat and decided to dig his grave deeper by lying through his teeth about the circumstances of my departure. Well, it was entirely her choice to leave, because she wanted to prove she could be independent like her big sister, so we decided to support her decision to move out. The sound of the heavy legal folder hitting the glass coffee table shattered the silence and made everyone in the room flinch as if they had been physically slapped. Grandma Louise stepped forward until she was inches away from his face, and her voice dropped to a terrifyingly low register that commanded absolute attention. Do not insult my intelligence by lying to my face when I know exactly what you did to your own daughter just to please this lazy girl. She reached into the folder to pull out a stack of documents that proved she was the sole legal owner of the property they were currently defiling with their presence. She then revealed a second set of papers, which were bank statements highlighting unauthorized withdrawals that Ralph had made over the last 5 years. She exposed the fact that he had been secretly siphoning money from the college fund she had established for me and using it to fund Savannah's lavish lifestyle and designer clothing habits. My mother gasped audibly and covered her mouth with her hands while Savannah looked at her father with a mixture of shock and betrayal that he had been caught stealing. You stole money meant for Delilah's education just so you could buy expensive purses for a daughter who has never worked a day in her life. I stood silently behind Grandma Louise, watching the destruction of my father's ego as the evidence of his theft lay spread out across the pizza-stained table for everyone to see. He tried to stammer out an excuse, claiming that he had only borrowed the money and intended to pay it back once his investments paid off, but nobody believed him. Grandma Louise laughed humorlessly at his pathetic attempt to justify stealing from his own child to spoil another who clearly did not appreciate the sacrifice. She looked at Monica, who was weeping silently, and asked her how she could call herself a mother while allowing such injustice to occur under her own roof without protesting. Grandma Louise looked at the pathetic trio before her and delivered her final verdict with the authority of a judge sentencing criminals to life in prison. She declared, "If Delilah does not have a place in this house because of your selfishness, then absolutely no one is allowed to live here because I am taking the house back immediately." The color drained from Ralph's face, leaving him looking like a ghost, while the reality of his mother's words crashed down on him with the weight of a collapsing building. The silence that followed my grandmother's eviction notice was shattered almost immediately by a shrill scream from Savannah, who stood up so abruptly that her chair toppled over backward. She looked at Grandma Louise with a mixture of disbelief and pure venom because she had never been denied anything in her entire life. She slammed her manicured hands onto the glass table and leaned forward aggressively while her face turned a deep shade of crimson red from indignation. She shrieked that Grandma was clearly suffering from dementia because she was speaking nonsense about taking away their family home. "You are just a senile old woman who has lost her mind. This is my parents' house, and you have absolutely no right to kick us out onto the street just because you favor Delilah." Grandma Louise did not even blink at the insult, nor did she turn her head to acknowledge the screaming woman standing before her. She kept her steely gaze fixed entirely on my father, who was currently shrinking into the sofa cushions as if he wished the floor would swallow him whole. She spoke to him with a calm authority that cut through Savannah's tantrums like a sharp knife cutting through fabric. She commanded him to explain the reality of their financial situation to his golden daughter, before she embarrassed herself any further with her ignorance. Ralph looked up at his mother with pleading eyes, but found absolutely no mercy in her expression, which forced him to finally face the humiliation he had been avoiding for decades. He turned slowly toward Savannah, who was still breathing heavily with rage and waiting for him to defend her honor against the crazy grandmother. Ralph swallowed hard and his voice trembled noticeably as he admitted the shameful truth that destroyed the illusion of success he had built around himself. He confessed that the deed to the house had always been in Grandma's name, and even the luxury SUV parked in the driveway was leased under her credit because his own credit score was ruined years ago. Savannah stopped screaming instantly, and her mouth fell open as she looked back and forth between her parents in absolute horror. The realization that her wealthy upbringing was entirely funded by the grandmother she had just insulted crashed down on her like a tidal wave. She slumped back onto the sofa, looking as if she had been physically punched in the gut because her entire identity as a rich girl had just evaporated in seconds. Monica realized that their ship was sinking fast, so she decided to switch tactics from denial to emotional manipulation. She threw herself at Grandma Louise's feet and tried to grab her hands while tears streamed down her face in a display of desperate theatricality. She wailed about how unfair life had been to them recently and tried to use Savannah's failed marriage as a shield against consequences. "Mother, please have some mercy on us because Savannah is already devastated by her divorce and cannot handle being homeless right now." Grandma Louise looked down at her daughter-in-law with a look of utter disgust and pulled her hands away sharply as if she had touched something contagious. She told Monica that if she had spent half as much energy raising her daughters equally as she did making excuses for Savannah, they would not be in this mess. She reached into her purse again and pulled out her phone to cancel the supplementary credit cards she had generously provided to Ralph years ago to help with household expenses. She informed them that as of this moment the financial tap was officially turned off, and they would have to learn to survive on their own meager incomes. Ralph watched in despair as the notifications on his phone started pinging to alert him that his access to the family accounts had been terminated permanently. The lifestyle of easy money and subsidized living that had allowed him to be arrogant and lazy was gone forever. Grandma Louise stood up straight and smoothed down her coat before delivering the final terms of their punishment. She stated clearly that they had exactly 30 days to pack their belongings and vacate the premises before she changed the locks. She warned them that she would be listing the property for sale immediately and that absolutely no amount of begging or negotiating would change her mind. "I suggest you start packing tonight instead of eating pizza because I will not give you a single extra hour beyond the deadline." She turned around and walked out the front door without looking back once, while I followed her with a sense of grim satisfaction filling my chest. I left my family sitting in the ruin of their own making as the reality of their bleak future finally settled over the silent living room. The first week following the eviction notice passed in a blur of constant digital harassment that made it impossible for me to relax even while living in the safety of Aunt Betsy's house. My phone vibrated incessantly on the nightstand, with a barrage of notifications from my former family members who were desperate to regain their lost control. My mother sent long and rambling paragraphs detailing her various physical ailments, which she claimed were being exacerbated by the stress I was causing her. She tried to guilt me into submission by saying that I was killing her with my cruelty and that a good daughter would never abandon her parents. I chose to ignore her manipulative attempts because I knew she was simply trying to weaponize her health to avoid the consequences of her own poor parenting choices. Savannah adopted a much more aggressive approach when she realized that her initial attempts at playing the victim were being met with absolute silence from my end. She switched tactics from pathetic begging to outright hostility within the span of a single afternoon as her true colors shone through. I was sitting in the kitchen helping Aunt Betsy prepare dinner when my phone lit up with a particularly vicious text message from my sister. "You are a poisonous snake. What did you inject into Grandma's head? Isn't ruining my life enough for you? You better tell her to take back her words." I showed the message to Aunt Betsy, who shook her head in disgust, but advised me to keep blocking their numbers rather than engaging in a war of words. However, Savannah was not content with just harassing me privately because she needed an audience to validate her twisted version of reality. She took her grievances to Facebook, where she wrote lengthy posts, crafting a fictional narrative about how I was abusing our elderly grandmother. She claimed that I had taken advantage of Grandma Louise's declining mental state to manipulate her into signing over the family assets to me. Hundreds of strangers and distant relatives commented on her posts, calling me an ungrateful granddaughter and offering their prayers for the poor, suffering family being evicted. Aunt Betsy discovered these slanderous posts one evening while scrolling through her iPad, and her face turned purple with suppressed rage. She debated whether to show them to Grandma Louise because she worried about her mother's health, but decided that Grandma had a right to know the extent of the betrayal. Grandma Louise sat in the armchair reading the lies Savannah had written about her being senile and mentally incompetent, with a shaking hand. Her face flushed a deep red, and her breathing became shallow, which terrified me because I thought she might be having a medical emergency due to the stress. We offered to call a doctor, but she waved us away with a fierce determination that proved she was far from frail. Grandma Louise demanded that I bring her phone immediately because she was done playing nice with people who were trying to destroy my reputation publicly. She dialed Ralph's number and put the call on speakerphone so we could witness the conversation that was about to take place. My father answered on the first ring with a hopeful tone in his voice because he clearly assumed his mother was calling to apologize and cancel the eviction. He started blabbering about how much they missed us and how they were ready to forgive everything if we just came home. Grandma Louise cut him off mid-sentence with a voice so cold it sounded like cracking ice and delivered a new verdict that shattered his hopes completely. Because you do not know how to repent and still dare to insult Delilah publicly, the 30-day limit is canceled. I give you 2 weeks. I will arrive in exactly 14 days. She hung up the phone before he could even process what she had said and sat back in her chair with a satisfied expression on her face. The silence on the other end of the line must have been deafening as Ralph realized that his daughter's online tantrum had just cost them half of their packing time. The fallout from that phone call was immediate and catastrophic for my parents, who were now racing against a clock that was ticking twice as fast. Ralph scrambled to find a rental property in Tulsa that would accept a family of 3 on such short notice, but he hit a massive wall. He discovered that he could not get approved for even the most basic apartments because his credit score was absolutely abysmal. It turned out that the secret bank withdrawals Grandma found were not just for Savannah's shopping, but also to cover significant gambling debts he had accumulated over the years. Landlords took one look at his financial history and rejected his applications without a second thought, which left him in a state of pure panic. He had relied on Grandma Louise's good credit for so long that he had forgotten that in the real world, you are judged by your own financial reliability. The safety net was gone, and for the first time in his life, my father was falling without a parachute. The deadline arrived with the inevitability of a storm front as the sun rose on the 14th day of the shortened eviction notice. I drove my car slowly down the familiar street with Grandma Louise beside me and 2 police cruisers trailing closely behind us. We had requested the law enforcement present specifically to ensure that the removal of my family was handled legally and safely given Savannah's recent volatility. Neighbors were already peeking out from behind their curtains to watch the spectacle unfold on what was usually a quiet Sunday morning in our neighborhood. I parked the car at the curb and watched as the officers approached the front door with their hands resting cautiously on their belts. The situation inside the house devolved into chaos the moment the officers knocked firmly on the wooden door and announced their presence. Savannah had barricaded herself inside her bedroom and was screaming hysterically that she would not leave her home for anyone. She began throwing heavy objects including lamps and books through the open window, which crashed onto the front lawn and shattered into pieces. The police officers wasted no time in breaking down the bedroom door to subdue her before she could hurt herself or anyone else. They escorted her out of the house in handcuffs while she kicked and screamed with her hair in a wild disarray that looked nothing like her usual polished appearance. Ralph and Monica stood on the sidewalk next to a small pile of cardboard boxes, looking utterly defeated and aged by 10 years in just 2 weeks. My father saw me standing near my car and broke away from the officers to run toward me with desperation etched into every line of his face. He grabbed my arm with shaking hands and looked into my eyes with a pleading expression that made my stomach churn. "Delilah, I beg you, please talk to your grandmother right now. We are family. How can you bear to see your parents and sister living on the street like this?" I pulled my arm away from his grasp and looked at him with a numbness that surprised even me because I expected to feel guilt. I realized that the man standing before me was not a father, but a stranger who had chosen his favorite child over his integrity. I spoke to him one last time with a voice that was devoid of any warmth or hesitation. "The family died the moment you kicked me out for her." He recoiled as if I had struck him physically and slumped his shoulders in defeat as the officers guided him toward his car. They loaded their meager belongings into the trunk of their sedan and drove away from the beautiful home they had taken for granted for decades. They had no choice but to move into a dilapidated apartment complex on the north side of Tulsa, which was the only place that would accept them. The area was notorious for high crime rates and constant noise pollution, which was a stark contrast to the quiet, suburban life they were used to. I imagined Savannah trying to sleep through the sound of police sirens and shouting neighbors in a cramped room with peeling paint. The consequences of their actions continued to spiral downward in the days following the eviction, as reality hit them hard. The news of the dramatic police involvement at our former residence spread quickly through the local community and eventually reached my father's employer. Ralph was called into his boss's office the very next morning and was fired immediately for bringing shame upon the company's reputation. He lost not only his income, but also the health insurance that my mother relied on for her constant medical complaints. They attempted one final act of desperation a few days later by showing up at the new apartment I was renting temporarily. They banged on the secure front gate, screaming my name and demanding that I come down to give them money for food and rent. However, I had already anticipated this move and had provided their photos to the building management and the local precinct. The security guards intercepted them at the entrance and threatened to arrest them for trespassing if they ever returned. I watched from my balcony as they were turned away in shame and realized that I was finally free from their toxic influence forever. 1 year has passed since the hurricane named Savannah tore through my life and destroyed the facade of my perfect family. My existence has transformed in positive ways that I never dared to dream of during those dark days, living in fear of my father's judgment. The silence that followed the eviction was initially painful, but it eventually blossomed into a profound sense of peace that I had never experienced before. I have maintained a strict and absolute no-contact policy with Ralph, Monica, and Savannah to protect my mental health from their toxic manipulation. I blocked every single phone number and social media profile associated with them so that I could finally focus entirely on my own future. My career in graphic design has flourished significantly now that I am no longer weighed down by the constant stress of living in a hostile environment. I have also become the primary companion for Grandma Louise, who seems to have regained her youthful energy now that the leeching burden of her son is gone. We spend our weekends gardening in her backyard or visiting Aunt Betsy for long dinners filled with genuine laughter instead of tension. Aunt Betsy still maintains a minimal amount of contact with my biological parents because she feels a lingering sense of familial obligation to check on them occasionally. She reports back to us with stories that confirm I made the right decision to cut ties completely. I learned that Savannah did not learn a single lesson from the eviction and continued her chaotic behavior almost immediately after moving into the North Side apartment. She rushed into a whirlwind romance with a local mechanic she met at a bar, hoping he would be her new financial savior. However, the relationship imploded after only 3 weeks because he refused to tolerate her entitlement and kicked her out of his trailer. Savannah is now back in the cramped apartment, sleeping on a stained mattress in the living room and complaining daily about how the world has treated her unfairly. She refuses to find a job because she still believes that manual labor is beneath someone of her imaginary social status. The situation for my parents is even more tragic because they have effectively swapped roles in the most ironic twist of fate imaginable. Ralph has sunk into a deep depression fueled by cheap vodka and spends his days staring at the television in their dark living room. He is consumed by regret over losing his easy life, but he lacks the strength of character to actually pull himself together and find new employment. Monica is now the sole provider for the household, and she is forced to work double shifts as a dishwasher at a greasy diner to pay their rent. It is a poetic justice that the woman who enabled her daughter's laziness is now scrubbing dirty plates to feed that same ungrateful child. Aunt Betsy says that the neighbors constantly complain about the screaming matches that erupt between Monica and Savannah over money and space. They are trapped together in a miserable cycle of blame and poverty that they created entirely with their own selfish choices. The most profound lesson I have taken from this agonizing experience is that sharing DNA does not automatically make people your family. True family consists of the people who respect your boundaries and support your well-being, rather than those who view you as a resource to be exploited. I spent so many years trying to buy my parents' love with obedience and money, only to realize that their love was always conditional on my submission. I also learned that financial independence is the only true shield a woman has against the unpredictability of life and toxic relationships. If I had not saved my money and maintained my own career, I would have been helpless when my father delivered his ultimatum in that kitchen. Self-respect is a currency that is far more valuable than any inheritance or approval you might receive from people who do not value you. I hope that my story serves as a wake-up call for anyone who is currently suffering in silence within a toxic family dynamic. You have the power to walk away from people who hurt you, even if society tells you that you owe them your loyalty because of blood ties. Please do not wait until you are kicked out to start building your own safety net, because your freedom is worth every penny you save. Thank you so much for listening to my long journey and for all the supportive comments you have left throughout this series. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts in the comments section below.